What would you do if one whispered word turned your world upside down? This incredible story of love, courage, and redemption will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you're ready for an emotional journey, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you. The restaurant was bustling with the sound of clinking glasses, quiet laughter, and the murmur of conversations as waiters in crisp uniforms weaved expertly through the tables. Among the diners was Alexander Reed, a sharp-dressed man in his early 40s, seated at a prime table near the large, floor-to-ceiling windows. His presence commanded attention. With his tailored suit and air of quiet authority, he exuded the confidence of someone who had built his life on hard work and success. Alexander had come to this upscale establishment to celebrate the closing of a major business deal. It was meant to be a quiet evening, an escape from the constant demands of his life. But as he leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine, he noticed something unusual, a small figure standing hesitantly a few feet away from his table. It was a young girl, no more than 10 years old, with curly dark hair framing her round face. Her clothes were simple, not matching the elegance of the restaurant, and she clutched a small, crumpled note in her hand. She seemed out of place, her large, nervous eyes darting between Alexander and the floor as if summoning the courage to approach him. "Excuse me, sir," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander glanced up from his wine glass, confused. "Yes," he replied, his tone polite but reserved. The girl took a hesitant step forward, her hands trembling as she extended the note toward him. Alexander frowned but took the note, glancing briefly at the paper. Before he could read it, the girl's next words stopped him cold. "Mom said, you're my dad." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alexander froze, staring at the girl in disbelief. His first reaction was that this had to be some kind of mistake, a prank, perhaps, or a misunderstanding. But as he looked closer at the girl, something familiar tugged at the edges of his memory. Her dark eyes, the curve of her smile, it was as though he were looking at a shadow of someone he had known long ago. "What did you say?" Alexander asked, his voice low and controlled, though a hint of uncertainty crept in. The girl swallowed hard, her small hands clenching the sides of her dress. "Mom said you're my dad," she repeated, her voice trembling. Alexander's sharp instincts, honed by years of negotiating deals and navigating high-stakes situations, failed him in that moment. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely unmoored. Before he could respond, he saw a figure standing across the room, frozen in place. It was Evelyn. Evelyn, a waitress at the restaurant, was standing by the bar, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. Her wide eyes darted between Alexander and the girl, her daughter, Olivia. The tray she had been holding slipped slightly in her hands before she set it down on the counter, as if realizing that the confrontation she had long dreaded was finally here. Alexander's gaze locked onto her, recognition dawning slowly but unmistakably. He hadn't seen Evelyn in over a decade, but there was no mistaking the woman who now stood staring at him as though she'd been caught in a trap. Memories flashed through his mind, memories of a brief, whirlwind romance with a charming and intelligent woman he had met during a business trip years ago. "Evelyn," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. Evelyn didn't move at first. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Finally, with visible reluctance, she approached the table. Each step she took seemed weighted, and by the time she reached them, her face was set in a mask of resignation. "Alexander," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. Alexander gestured to Olivia, his voice rising slightly. "What is she talking about? Is this true?" Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She glanced down at Olivia, who was now looking at her with wide, questioning eyes. Evelyn knelt beside her daughter, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Olivia," she said gently, "why don't you go back to the kitchen for a moment? I need to talk to Mr. Reed. Olivia hesitated, clearly not wanting to leave. But, Mom. Please, sweetheart, Evelyn insisted, her voice soft but firm. I'll explain everything soon. Reluctantly, Olivia nodded and walked away, casting one last glance at Alexander before disappearing behind the kitchen doors. Once Olivia was out of earshot, Alexander leaned forward, his expression hard. You'd better start explaining, Evelyn. Is she really, my daughter? Evelyn's shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. Yes, Alexander. She's your daughter. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as the words sank in. You knew all this time? And you didn't think to tell me? I had my reasons, Evelyn said quickly, her voice defensive. It wasn't that simple, Alexander. You left. You moved on with your life. I didn't think you'd care. I didn't care? Alexander repeated, his voice rising. You decided that for me? Evelyn flinched but held her ground. I did what I thought was best for her. And for me. Alexander leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he processed this revelation. For a man who prided himself on staying in control, this was a blow he hadn't anticipated. His mind raced with questions. Why had she kept this from him? What kind of life had Olivia been living? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? As the weight of the situation settled over him, Alexander knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. The tension between Alexander and Evelyn was palpable, filling the elegant dining area like an invisible storm. Alexander's jaw tightened as he stared at her, waiting for an explanation. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around to ensure no patrons were listening. She knew this conversation could only lead to trouble, but there was no escaping it now. Let's go somewhere private, Evelyn said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve was clear. We can't talk here. Alexander nodded curtly, gesturing for her to lead the way. She guided him to a quiet back office near the kitchen, its modest size and plain decor a stark contrast to the luxurious dining room outside. Once inside, Evelyn shut the door and leaned against it, as if gathering the strength to face him. Alexander wasted no time. Start talking, Evelyn. Why didn't you tell me I had a daughter? His voice was low but firm, the anger barely contained. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of a desk for support. I didn't know how to reach you, Alexander, she began. You left so suddenly. We weren't serious, and then you disappeared. That's not an excuse, he snapped. You could have found a way. You knew my company, my name, there were plenty of ways to contact me. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. It wasn't just that, she admitted. When I found out I was pregnant, I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And then, someone made it clear that it would be better if I stayed quiet. Alexander frowned, his anger giving way to confusion. What are you talking about? Someone told you to stay quiet? Who? Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Your father, she said quietly. He came to see me after you left. Those words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. His father, Edward Reed, was a powerful man with a reputation for being ruthless in both business and personal matters. Alexander knew his father valued the family's reputation above all else, but this was something else entirely. What did he say? Alexander asked, his voice colder now. Evelyn hesitated, the memory clearly painful. He told me that if I tried to contact you, he'd make my life a living hell. He offered me money to stay quiet, said it was better for everyone if you never found out. I refused the money, but I believed his threats. I was a single waitress with no resources, and he was a powerful man. What chance did I have against him? Alexander's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the anger boiling inside him, not at Evelyn, but at his father. "And you just went along with it?" he asked, though his tone had softened. "What choice did I have?" Evelyn shot back, her voice rising slightly. "I did what I thought was best for Olivia. I raised her on my own, and I've done the best I could." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small room as he tried to process everything. "And Olivia? What does she know? Why did she come up to me tonight?" Evelyn sighed, her shoulders slumping. "She overheard me talking to a friend. I didn't mean for her to find out this way. She's always asked about her father, and I've avoided the topic for years. But when she found out it was you, she decided to take matters into her own hands." Alexander stopped pacing, turning to face her. "And what am I supposed to do now, Evelyn? Just pretend this didn't happen? Pretend she's not my daughter?" Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes filled with emotion. "I don't know, Alexander. But I do know that Olivia deserves better than what she's had. She deserves to know her father." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. Alexander thought about Olivia, her wide, hopeful eyes, the courage it must have taken for her to approach him. Despite his anger and confusion, one thing was clear: he couldn't walk away from this. "I want to meet her," Alexander said finally, his voice steady. Evelyn looked startled. "What?" "I want to spend time with her," he repeated. "If she's my daughter, I need to get to know her. I'm not letting my father's interference dictate my life anymore." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "But take it slow, Alexander. She's been through a lot." Alexander nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let anyone, not even his father, keep him from building a relationship with his daughter. As they stepped out of the office, Alexander caught a glimpse of Olivia peeking around the corner. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Alexander allowed himself to smile, just a little. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. The next day, Alexander arrived at the small suburban house where Evelyn and Olivia lived. The house was modest but neat, with a small garden in the front yard. Alexander couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he stepped out of his sleek black car, the contrast between their lives glaringly obvious. He adjusted his tie nervously, an unfamiliar sensation for the usually composed businessman. Evelyn opened the door before he could knock, her expression a mixture of apprehension and determination. "She's in the living room," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. As Alexander entered, his eyes landed on Olivia, who was sitting cross-legged on the couch with a sketchbook in her lap. She looked up when she heard him, her wide eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "Hi, Olivia," Alexander said, his voice softer than he intended. He crouched slightly, trying to meet her eye level. "It's nice to see you again." Olivia hesitated before nodding. "Hi," she said, her voice small but steady. Alexander glanced at the sketchbook in her lap. "What are you drawing?" he asked, trying to ease the tension. Olivia held it up shyly. It was a colorful drawing of a garden, complete with flowers, butterflies, and a large tree in the center. "It's the park near here," she explained. "I like to draw things that make me happy." "That's beautiful," Alexander said sincerely. "You're very talented." Olivia blushed slightly, her fingers gripping the edges of the paper. "Mom says I'm good too." Evelyn, standing in the doorway, watched the interaction with a mixture of relief and caution. She decided to give them some space. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me," she said before retreating. The room fell silent for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. Alexander took a deep breath, deciding to address the elephant in the room. "Olivia," he began, his tone gentle, "your mom told me a little about why you came to talk to me at the restaurant. I didn't know I had a daughter. But now that I do, I want to get to know you. Olivia tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing in thought. You really didn't know about me? She asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Alexander shook his head. No, I didn't. If I had, I would have been here sooner. I promise you that. Olivia studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. Do you want to be my dad? She asked bluntly, the question catching Alexander off guard. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. Yes, he said firmly. If you'll let me. For the first time, Olivia smiled, a small, tentative curve of her lips. Okay, she said simply, wanting to make their first meeting memorable. Alexander suggested taking Olivia to the park she had drawn. Evelyn agreed, though she insisted on coming along, still wary of how things would unfold. At the park, Alexander was struck by how free and happy Olivia seemed as she ran through the grass, her curls bouncing with each step. She pointed out the tree she had drawn, proudly showing him the real-life version. Do you like it? She asked, her eyes bright with excitement. I love it, Alexander replied. It's even better than the drawing. They spent hours exploring the park, with Olivia eagerly telling him about her favorite places. Alexander found himself genuinely enjoying the time with her, his usual worries and responsibilities momentarily forgotten. Evelyn watched from a distance, her arms crossed as she leaned against a bench. Seeing them together stirred a mixture of emotions, relief, hope, and a lingering fear that it could all fall apart. Before they left the park, Olivia picked a small bouquet of wildflowers. She handed them to Alexander with a shy smile. For you, she said. Alexander took the flowers, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Thank you, Olivia. I'll keep these in my office. Olivia giggled. They'll die if you don't put them in water. Alexander laughed softly, realizing how right she was. Then I guess I'll have to find a vase as soon as we get home. That evening, as Alexander drove back to his penthouse apartment, the bouquet of flowers resting on the passenger seat, he couldn't stop thinking about Olivia. For years, he had been consumed by his career, believing that success would bring him fulfillment. But today, spending time with his daughter, he had felt something he hadn't realized he was missing: connection, purpose, and a sense of family. He knew there were still challenges ahead. His father's interference, Evelyn's lingering distrust, and Olivia's adjustment to having a father in her life were all hurdles they would need to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt ready to face them. As he parked his car and stepped into his apartment, Alexander placed the flowers in a glass of water and set them on his desk. They were a small reminder of the hope that had blossomed in his life, and the promise of a future he was determined to build, with Olivia at the center of it. The warmth of Alexander's first day with Olivia lingered, but the more he thought about their blossoming relationship, the more questions haunted him. His father's involvement in silencing Evelyn gnawed at his mind. Alexander couldn't ignore the possibility that Edward Reed, known for his ruthless control and manipulative tactics, was still working behind the scenes to keep Olivia and Evelyn out of his life. A few days later, Alexander invited Evelyn to meet him at a quiet cafe in the city. He needed answers, and she was the only one who could provide them. Evelyn arrived hesitantly, her posture defensive as she slid into the chair across from him. "What's this about, Alexander?" she asked, her tone guarded. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I need to know everything about my father's involvement. You said he threatened you, but I need details. What exactly did he say? What did he do?" Evelyn sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "It was right after you left," she began. "I found out I was pregnant a few weeks later. I was terrified, but I decided I needed to tell you. Before I could, your father showed up at my apartment. He said he knew about the baby." Alexander's jaw tightened. "How did he find out?" "He had someone watching you," Evelyn explained. When I started showing, he must have pieced it together. He came to my door and said that if I tried to contact you, he'd ruin my life. He threatened to make sure I lost my job, my home, everything. He even said no one would believe me if I tried to go public. Alexander clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. And you believed him? Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes flashing with anger. Of course, I believed him. He wasn't bluffing, Alexander. I saw what he was capable of. He offered me money to stay quiet, and when I refused, he said he'd destroy me in other ways. Determined to uncover the truth, Alexander decided it was time to confront his father directly. Edward Reed was a towering figure in the business world, his name synonymous with power and influence. But to Alexander, he was also the man who had manipulated and controlled his life for far too long. Alexander arrived at the sprawling family estate, the cold marble and towering pillars a stark reminder of the life he had fought to escape. He found Edward in his study, surrounded by dark wood paneling and the faint scent of cigars. Alexander, Edward greeted, his tone cool but cordial. To what do I owe the pleasure? Alexander didn't waste time on pleasantries. I know what you did to Evelyn, he said, his voice low and firm. You threatened her, kept her from telling me about my daughter. How could you do that? Edward's expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or annoyance, in his eyes. I did what was necessary to protect our family's reputation, he said evenly. You were young, reckless. That child would have been a distraction. She's my daughter. Alexander snapped, his voice rising. You had no right to make that decision for me. You robbed me of 10 years with her. Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze icy. And look where you are now, successful, respected. Do you think you'd have achieved all this if you were tied down with a child? Alexander's hands clenched into fists. You don't get it, do you? None of this means anything if it cost me my family. I'm done letting you control my life. Edward's face darkened, his voice hardening. Be careful, Alexander. Don't let sentimentality cloud your judgment. That girl and her mother are liabilities. That girl is my daughter, Alexander said coldly. And if you ever try to interfere in her life again, I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of man you are. After his confrontation with Edward, Alexander knew he couldn't trust his father to stay away. He needed to ensure Olivia and Evelyn were protected. He hired a private investigator to look into Edward's activities, hoping to uncover any leverage he could use against him. In the meantime, Alexander became more involved in Olivia's life. He began taking her to school, attending her art classes, and spending evenings helping her with homework. Their bond deepened with each passing day, and Olivia started to see him not just as a figure from her mother's past but as someone she could trust and rely on. One evening, as Alexander was leaving Evelyn's house after dropping off Olivia, he noticed a car parked down the street. It had been there earlier when he arrived, and now its headlights flickered on as he walked to his own vehicle. The engine roared to life, and the car sped away, disappearing into the night. Alexander's instincts told him this was no coincidence. He called Evelyn as soon as he got home. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? He asked. Evelyn hesitated. A few days ago, I found a strange note in the mailbox. It didn't say much, just keep your distance. I thought it was just junk mail, but now I'm not so sure. Alexander's jaw tightened. Don't ignore things like that. I'll make sure you're safe, Evelyn. I promise. As Alexander sat in his apartment that night, staring out at the city lights, he couldn't shake the feeling that his father was already trying to interfere. He knew Edward wouldn't back down easily. But for the first time in his life, Alexander wasn't afraid to stand up to him. He was fighting for his daughter now, and nothing, not even Edward Reed, would stop him. The note Evelyn received and the mysterious car watching her house were only the beginning. Alexander's suspicions about his father's interference deepened, but he hadn't realized just how far Edward Reed would go to maintain control. As Alexander tried to shield Evelyn and Olivia from his father's influence, the battle escalated into something far more dangerous. One evening, Evelyn and Olivia were walking home from the local market. It was a quiet, chilly night, the streets lit by the warm glow of street lamps. Olivia skipped ahead, holding a small bag of groceries, while Evelyn followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the street out of habit. She hadn't told Olivia about the threats. They were her burden to bear, but the weight of fear was becoming harder to hide. Just as they turned onto their street, a dark car screeched to a halt nearby. Two men in suits stepped out, their faces shadowed under the dim light. Evelyn instinctively pulled Olivia close, her heart pounding. "Evelyn Myers," one of the men said, his voice cold and businesslike. "What do you want?" Evelyn demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man held up an envelope and smirked. "A friendly warning. Stay away from Alexander Reed. Don't let the girl get too comfortable." Before Evelyn could respond, the men climbed back into the car and sped off, leaving her standing in the middle of the street, trembling. Olivia clutched her mother's hand tightly, her face pale with fear. "Mom, who were they?" Olivia whispered, her voice shaking. Evelyn knelt down and pulled Olivia into a tight embrace. "No one you need to worry about," she said softly, though her own fear was evident. "Let's get home." The next morning, Evelyn called Alexander, her voice frantic. "We need to talk," she said. "It's about your father." Alexander arrived at Evelyn's house within the hour. He found her pacing the living room, her face pale and her hands shaking. Olivia was upstairs, busy with her drawings, unaware of the conversation unfolding below. "What happened?" Alexander asked, his tone urgent. Evelyn recounted the incident from the previous night, describing the men, their warning, and the envelope they left behind. She handed it to Alexander, her hands trembling. Alexander opened the envelope to find a short, typed note: "This is your final warning. Keep your distance, or there will be consequences." The message was unsigned, but the implication was clear. Alexander's jaw tightened as he crumpled the note in his fist. "This has my father written all over it," he said. "He's trying to scare you into submission." "He's not just trying, Alexander," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "I'm terrified. What if he hurts Olivia?" "He won't," Alexander said firmly. "I won't let him." Determined to protect Evelyn and Olivia, Alexander enlisted the help of a trusted private investigator, Martin Blake. Martin had worked with Alexander in the past and was known for his ability to uncover hidden truths. "I want you to dig into my father's activities," Alexander told Martin. "Find out who he's using to intimidate Evelyn and Olivia. I need names, locations, everything." Martin nodded, his expression serious. "I'll get started right away." In the meantime, Alexander hired a security team to watch over Evelyn's house and accompany her and Olivia whenever they left. Evelyn initially resisted the idea, worried it would draw even more attention, but Alexander's insistence won her over. "I won't take chances with your safety," he said. "Not anymore." Despite the added security, the tension weighed heavily on everyone. Olivia began to sense that something was wrong, though Evelyn and Alexander tried to shield her from the details. One evening, as Alexander sat with Olivia helping her with a school project, she looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. "Why are there men outside our house?" she asked. "Are they bad guys?" Alexander hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They're there to keep you and your mom safe," he said gently. "Sometimes grown-ups have to deal with problems, but it's my job to make sure you don't have to worry about them." Olivia nodded slowly, though her small brow furrowed with concern. "Okay," she said. "But you'll protect us, right?" Alexander smiled, his voice steady. "Always." A week later, Martin returned with new information. "You were right," he said, sliding a file across Alexander's desk. "Your father's been using some pretty shady connections to keep tabs on Evelyn. The two men who approached her are private contractors. They've got ties to a security firm your father owns through a shell company." Alexander's stomach turned as he flipped through the file. "And the car outside her house?" "Same group," Martin confirmed. "They've been following her movements, but they're careful not to cross any legal lines, barely." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. His father's influence was deeper than he had imagined, and confronting him directly hadn't been enough. He needed a new strategy, something that would expose Edward's actions publicly and ensure he could no longer harm the people Alexander cared about. That evening, Alexander returned to Evelyn's house with a plan. "We need to take this to the authorities," he told her. "If we can prove my father's been threatening you, we can stop him." Evelyn hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "But what if it makes things worse? What if he retaliates?" "He won't," Alexander said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." "But we can't keep living like this, Evelyn. Olivia deserves better." Evelyn looked at him, her resolve hardening. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." With Martin's help, Alexander compiled a dossier of evidence against his father, including the threats, surveillance, and connections to the private security firm. They presented it to the authorities, filing a formal complaint. The process was slow, but Alexander felt a sense of relief knowing they were finally taking action. As the days passed, Evelyn and Olivia began to feel the first glimmers of hope. The presence of the security team, combined with Alexander's unwavering support, gave them a sense of safety they hadn't known in years. For Alexander, the battle was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like he was regaining control, not just over the situation, but over his life. And no matter what his father tried next, Alexander was determined to protect his daughter and build the family she deserved. The decision to go to the authorities had shifted the dynamic of Alexander's battle against his father. For the first time, Edward Reed's actions were being scrutinized by someone outside his carefully controlled network. But the move also brought new challenges. Edward was not a man to back down easily. As Alexander, Evelyn, and Olivia navigated the fallout, the stakes became higher, the dangers more real, and the bonds between them grew stronger. One morning, as Alexander sipped his coffee and scanned the news, his heart sank. The headlines were unmistakable: Reed family scandal, billionaire's alleged threats against single mother and child under investigation. The accompanying article detailed the allegations against Edward Reed, citing anonymous sources that hinted at Alexander's involvement in exposing the truth. The phone rang almost immediately. It was Evelyn. "Alexander," she said, her voice trembling, "did you see the news?" "I saw it," he replied grimly. "I didn't expect it to go public so quickly." "Do you think your father is behind this?" she asked. Alexander frowned. "No. This doesn't benefit him. If anything, it puts more pressure on him. Someone leaked it, but I'll find out who." "Olivia saw it," Evelyn said softly. "She asked me why people were talking about us." Alexander felt a pang of guilt. "I'll come over tonight," he said. "We'll talk to her together." That evening, Alexander sat down with Evelyn and Olivia at the kitchen table. Olivia looked small and vulnerable, her wide eyes darting between them as she fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. "Why is everyone saying bad things about Grandpa?" Olivia asked, her voice hesitant. Alexander exchanged a glance with Evelyn before answering. "Sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people," he said gently. "Your grandpa made some of those choices, and now people are asking questions about it." "But why did he hurt Mom?" Olivia asked, her voice breaking. "Why did he hurt me?" Alexander reached out and took her small hand in his. "I don't have all the answers, Olivia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to make sure he doesn't hurt you or your mom ever again." Olivia nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Evelyn wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going to be okay." The public exposure of his actions enraged Edward Reed. For years, he had controlled his image with an iron fist, cultivating the persona of a benevolent tycoon. Now, his reputation was crumbling, and he blamed Alexander. A few days later, Alexander received a summons to meet Edward at the family estate. Against his better judgment, he went, determined to face his father head-on. When Alexander entered the study, Edward was waiting, his expression colder than Alexander had ever seen. "You've made a grave mistake, Alexander," Edward said, his voice low and menacing. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've exposed the truth," Alexander replied, his tone unwavering. "Your power doesn't give you the right to ruin people's lives." Edward laughed bitterly. "You think this is about power? This is about protecting the Reed name, our legacy. You're throwing it all away for what? A woman and a child who mean nothing to this family?" "They mean everything to me," Alexander shot back. "And I'll protect them, no matter what it takes." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Then you've chosen your side. Don't expect me to help you when everything falls apart." Alexander turned to leave, his resolve stronger than ever. "I don't need your help," he said. "I never did." The next day, Alexander received an unexpected call from Martin, his private investigator. "I found something you're going to want to see," Martin said. "It's about your father." They met at Alexander's office, where Martin handed him a thick folder. "These are financial records and communications that tie Edward to illegal activities," Martin explained. "Bribery, blackmail, and connections to those contractors who harassed Evelyn. It's enough to bury him." Alexander flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening. "How did you get this?" Martin smirked. "Let's just say not everyone on your father's payroll is as loyal as he thinks." Armed with this evidence, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. He shared the findings with the authorities, ensuring that Edward's influence couldn't sweep the investigation under the rug. That evening, Alexander returned to Evelyn's house, the weight of the day's events heavy on his shoulders. As he sat on the couch, Olivia climbed onto his lap, her sketchbook in hand. "Look," she said, holding up a new drawing. It was a picture of the three of them, Evelyn, Alexander, and Olivia, standing together under a bright sun. Above their heads, she had written one word in large, colorful letters: family. Alexander felt his throat tighten as he looked at the drawing. "This is beautiful, Olivia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you like being part of our family?" Olivia asked innocently. "I love it," Alexander replied. "More than anything." Evelyn watched from across the room, her heart swelling. For all the chaos and uncertainty, moments like this reminded her that they were moving toward something better. As the legal case against Edward progressed, his influence began to wane. The media scrutiny forced him to step down from several high-profile positions, and his network of enablers started to crumble. For the first time, Alexander felt like he was winning, not just for himself, but for Evelyn and Olivia. But the battle wasn't over. Alexander knew that Edward wouldn't go down quietly. Still, as he looked at the drawing Olivia had made, he felt a renewed determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The legal and emotional war against Edward Reed had reached its peak. While Alexander had managed to weaken his father's grip on their lives, Edward's retaliation grew more desperate and dangerous. As Alexander, Evelyn, and Olivia stood together, they knew the final confrontation would determine their future. One morning, Alexander received an urgent call from Martin, his private investigator. "You won't believe this," Martin said. "Your father wants to meet. Privately." Alexander leaned back in his chair, skeptical. "What does he want?" He claims he's ready to negotiate, Martin replied. But I don't trust him. This feels like a trap. Despite Martin's warning, Alexander decided to meet his father, determined to confront him one last time. The meeting was arranged at a secluded country club, neutral ground where neither side would have the upper hand. When Alexander arrived, Edward was already waiting in a private room overlooking the golf course. He looked older, the weight of the scandal and public scrutiny visibly taking its toll. Yet, his eyes still held the cold, calculating glint Alexander knew all too well. "Alexander," Edward began, gesturing for him to sit. "You've made quite the mess. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done to this family?" "This family?" Alexander shot back. "The only damage done was by you. All I've done is reveal the truth." Edward sighed, shaking his head. "You're blinded by emotion. That woman and her child, they've made you weak." "Her name is Evelyn, and Olivia is my daughter," Alexander said firmly. "They're not weaknesses. They're my family, something you never understood." Edward's expression hardened. "Enough. I called you here to offer a solution. Walk away from them, and I'll make this all go away. The media, the investigation, everything. I can fix this, but only if you let them go." Alexander stared at his father, disgusted. "You still think you can control me, don't you? But here's the truth. You don't have any power over me anymore. And you won't have power over Evelyn or Olivia either. I'm done with you." Edward's face darkened, his voice turning icy. "Then you've made your choice. Don't come crying to me when everything falls apart." "I won't," Alexander said, standing. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm building something real. And you can't take that away from me." As Alexander walked away from the meeting, his phone buzzed with a call from Evelyn. Her voice was panicked. "Alexander, someone broke into the house." "What? Are you okay? Is Olivia okay?" he asked, his heart racing. "We're fine," Evelyn said, though her voice trembled. "The security team scared them off, but they left a note." Alexander arrived at Evelyn's house within the hour, finding her pale and shaken. Olivia sat on the couch, clutching her sketchbook, her eyes wide with fear. Alexander knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said gently. "You're safe now. I promise." Evelyn handed him the note, her hands trembling. It was short and typed, like the previous threats. "This is your last warning. Walk away, or they'll pay the price." Alexander's blood boiled. "This is him," he said through gritted teeth. "This is my father." Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, her voice firm. "We can't let him win, Alexander. We've come too far." That night, Alexander called Martin and the authorities, laying out a plan to expose Edward once and for all. With the evidence Martin had gathered, they were ready to take the fight to the next level. Alexander knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to end his father's reign of terror. "I'm going to protect you," Alexander told Evelyn as they sat together in the living room. "No matter what it takes." Evelyn nodded, her resolve matching his. "We'll protect her together." Later that evening, Alexander sat with Olivia as she worked on another drawing. She seemed calmer now, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet determination. "Daddy," she said softly, looking up at him. It was the first time she had called him that, and Alexander's heart swelled. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alexander pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "Yes, we are," he said firmly. "Because we're a family, and families stick together." Evelyn watched from the doorway, tears welling in her eyes. For all the fear and uncertainty, moments like this reminded her why they were fighting so hard. As the night fell, the house was quiet, but Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. His father was a dangerous man, and the threats they had faced were only the beginning. But for the first time, Alexander felt truly prepared to face whatever came next. With Evelyn and Olivia by his side, he knew they could overcome anything. Together, they were stronger than Edward Reed's schemes, stronger than the fear that had once controlled their lives. The next step would be the hardest, but Alexander was ready. It was time to bring the fight to Edward and ensure that his family would never live in fear again. The final confrontation with Edward Reed loomed large in Alexander's mind. For weeks, Alexander, Evelyn, and Olivia had lived under the shadow of Edward's threats. But now, with mounting evidence, determined allies, and an unbreakable resolve, Alexander was ready to end his father's reign of intimidation and fear once and for all. The day of the hearing was tense. Edward had been summoned to court, facing allegations of blackmail, harassment, and other charges tied to his attempts to control Alexander's life and keep Evelyn and Olivia away. The evidence Alexander and Martin had gathered was damning: records of payments to private contractors, threatening notes, and testimonies from former employees who had turned against Edward. Evelyn and Olivia sat in the courtroom gallery, Olivia clutching her sketchbook for comfort. Alexander stood with his legal team, his expression steely but calm. He glanced back at Olivia, and their eyes met. Her quiet courage gave him the strength he needed. Edward entered the courtroom, his usual commanding presence diminished. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, his age and the weight of his actions showing in his features. He cast a cold glare at Alexander, but Alexander refused to look away. One by one, witnesses took the stand, painting a picture of Edward's manipulation and cruelty. Martin presented the financial records, connecting Edward to the private contractors who had harassed Evelyn and Olivia. Former employees testified about the lengths Edward had gone to in order to silence those who threatened his reputation. Finally, Evelyn took the stand. She spoke with quiet strength, recounting the day Edward had come to her apartment and threatened her if she revealed Olivia's existence to Alexander. Her voice only wavered once, when she described how she had been forced to raise Olivia alone, fearing for their safety. When Evelyn finished, the room was silent. Even Edward's legal team seemed shaken by the weight of her words. When it was Alexander's turn to testify, he spoke passionately about the impact of Edward's actions on his life and his family. "My father thought he could control everything," he said, his voice firm. "But family isn't about control. It's about love, trust, and standing by each other, even when it's hard." Edward's lawyer tried to paint him as a man protecting his legacy, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The judge, a stern but fair woman, delivered the verdict swiftly. Edward was found guilty of multiple charges, including harassment and coercion, and was ordered to pay damages to Evelyn and Olivia. For Alexander, the victory wasn't just about justice, it was about breaking free from the shadow his father had cast over his life. As Edward was escorted out of the courtroom, his once mighty presence reduced to a figure of shame, Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders. That evening, Alexander, Evelyn, and Olivia returned to their home to celebrate. The house, once filled with tension and fear, now felt warm and safe. Alexander had arranged a small dinner with close friends and supporters, including Martin and some of the witnesses who had stood up against Edward. Olivia beamed as she showed everyone her latest drawing, a picture of herself, Alexander, and Evelyn standing together under a rainbow. Above their heads, she had written the word family in bold, colorful letters. "Do you like it?" she asked Alexander, holding it up proudly. Alexander knelt down beside her, his eyes misty. "I love it," he said. "It's perfect, just like you." As the guests began to leave, Alexander and Evelyn stood on the porch, watching Olivia play in the yard. The tension and fear that had once consumed their lives had finally been replaced by peace and hope. "You did it," Evelyn said, her voice soft. "You stood up to him and protected us." "We did it," Alexander corrected, taking her hand. "I couldn't have done this without you." Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening. "What now?" Now, Alexander said, looking out at Olivia, we start building the life she deserves. Together. Later that night, as Olivia slept peacefully in her room, Alexander sat at his desk, staring at a bouquet of wildflowers Olivia had picked for him earlier that day. They were simple, but to Alexander, they symbolized everything he had fought for: love, family, and a future free from fear. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. Are you coming to bed? In a minute, Alexander said, smiling at her. Just thinking. About what? She asked, stepping closer. About how one whispered word changed everything, he replied. I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it would make me happy. But it turns out, happiness was right here all along. Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. She's lucky to have you, she said. We both are. Alexander reached up, covering her hand with his own. No, he said softly. I'm the lucky one. As the house settled into silence, Alexander finally allowed himself to relax. The battles they had fought were behind them, and the path ahead was bright and full of promise. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace, ready to embrace the life he had always wanted, with the family he had fought so hard to protect. And for Olivia, the girl who had bravely whispered a life-changing truth, the future held endless possibilities, surrounded by love, safety, and the unwavering support of the father who would never let her down. This story is a powerful reminder of the strength it takes to stand up for what truly matters: family, love, and justice. Alexander's journey from a controlled and distant life to becoming a protector and father for Olivia shows us how much can change when we choose to fight for the ones we love. Evelyn's courage and Olivia's resilience brought them together, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope and love can light the way. If this story moved you as much as it did me, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. And let us know in the comments, what did you think of their journey? We'd love to hear your thoughts.